From Pacifica Radio, this is Democracy Now!
Choice is between democracy and empire.
Dick Cheney, dinosaur, we don't buy your oil war. People are talking about a regime change in Baghdad. I'm beginning to think we need a regime change right here in Washington, D.C.
Thousands marched to Dick Cheney's mansion in Washington, D.C., and more than 500,000 people protest against war in London and Rome. In this show of resistance, we'll hear the sounds of the street, but we'll begin in Baghdad with U.S. Congressmember Jim McDermott.
When we stop questioning our president, we are giving up a democracy and we're becoming a dictatorship.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The United States and Britain indicated they might tone down the wording of the United Nations Security Council resolution on Iraq. This comes as massive protests hit both London and Washington over the weekend, and as France, China, and Russia all expressed grave opposition to the resolution. Iraq also rejected the new proposal. The U.S. and England want to threaten Iraq with military action if it fails to sign up to a new tough inspections regime within 7 days and hand over full details of its weapons of mass destruction within 30 days if inspectors are readmitted. British Prime Minister Tony Blair told the BBC the resolution is, quote, probably not quite as definite as it might appear from some of the papers. United Nations and Iraqi officials are meeting to discuss the return of weapons inspectors to Iraq for the first time in 4 years. Many see it as the first real test of Iraq's commitment to cooperation with the UN since it agreed to the inspectors' unconditional return last month. The head of the UN inspections team, Hans Blix, aims to get Iraq's agreement on the practicalities of the inspections. He's indicated that access to suspect sites, including President Saddam Hussein's palaces, is a key issue on the agenda. Blix wants an advance party in Iraq by October 15th, but the draft resolution, which Washington and London are expected to put forward this week, could derail that. Israel pulled its tanks and soldiers out of Yasser Arafat's Ramallah headquarters on Sunday to end the 10-day siege. The London Guardian reports the U.S. forced Israel to lift the siege because it was undermining Washington's attempt to win Arab and other international support to attack Iraq. After the pullout, Arafat said Israel is failing to live up to UN requirements because its troops still control access to his headquarters. And here on the West Coast, cargo ports were shut down indefinitely Sunday night after a chaotic day on the waterfront that dashed hopes for a truce between dock workers and shipping lines, now in their 5th month of troubled contract talks. The Pacific Maritime Association, which represents international shipping lines and U.S.-based terminal operators, locked out union workers at the start of the 6 p.m. shift. Leaders of the International Longshore and Warehouse Union insisted they'd done nothing to provoke the action. In the event of a protracted shutdown, the Bush administration has indicated it'll consider invoking the Taft-Hartley Act, which would reopen the ports for an 80-day cooling-off period. Washington has also threatened to send federal troops if the dock workers go on strike. You are listening to Democracy Now! As we go to the protests in Washington with David Rovix.
I don't know about y'all, but George Bush has been my greatest inspiration for the past year at least. He said most of this here. We want a safer country, and it's in God we trust. So we'll bomb you during Ramadan, turn your world into dust. But pull up on your bootstraps, stand on your own 2 feet, as we blow them off with cluster bombs disguised as something to eat. We stand for freedom and prosperity, so we'll bomb your schools and hospitals. Make sure you live in liberty, and all you evildoers, and your children and your wives. With our B-52s, we'll show you how we value civilian lives. Give us you're hungry, you're restless. We'll show you democracy, a military trial, and detention indefinitely. We'll have homeland security. Thomas Ridge, all hail. We may not find the terrorists, but we can throw the left in jail. And we will all be safe, and we shall have no fears. Once our retinas have been scanned, and all the walls have ears, and we're all in good hands. When the FBI is in the know, we're sure they'll look after us, just like they did with COINTELPRO. So hang a flag in the window, all hail to the chief. Follow the leader and suspend your disbelief. Our country, right or wrong, you know what to do. Sing, God bless America, that red, white, and blue. You could sing with us on the God Bless America part especially. You know, it really sounds better with more people joining in. When facing anyone with box cutters, we'll say put up your dukes as we spend...
David Rovics and Ali Rosenblatt this weekend at the anti-war protests in Washington, D.C. On Sunday in the southern Iraqi port town of Basra, U.S. and British warplanes bombed a civilian airport for the second time in 3 days. During the attack, a congressional delegation, including Congressmember David Bonnier of Michigan, Jim McDermott of Washington, and Mike Thompson of California, were in Basra as part of a controversial tour of Iraq. Trent Lott, the Mississippi senator, said about Jim McDermott, he needs to come home and keep his mouth shut. Just a few hours ago, I spoke to Congressmember Jim McDermott, who'd returned to Baghdad.
Well, we came with two purposes. One was to deliver a message to the Iraqi officials that we had to have unfettered inspections, otherwise there would be war. We wanted to get the message to them from people who were opposed to the war, from people who had opposed the sanctions, and deliver that message to them so that they could, hopefully they could hear that there must be unfettered inspections. And I think we delivered the message, and we will now see in the next few weeks how that unfolds as the UN plans to go back into the inspection mode here in Baghdad. The second reason we came was to look at the humanitarian aspects of this. I'm a physician. I came here in 1991, about 4 months after the war ended, and saw the devastation of the water and sewage treatment and the hospitals and the lack of drugs and the lack of electricity, so there was no refrigeration in the hospital. I saw all of what was existent shortly after the war, and I wanted to see how much of it had improved and what it would be the effects of doing this again. The effect of 10 years of sanctions has been to absolutely wipe out the middle class in Iraq. The country is poor beyond belief when one knows what it was like 20 years ago. And it has serious shortages of drugs. We went into clinics and saw patients who had leukemias. The increase in leukemia rate among children is 100%. And there is a tremendous shortage of medications for the treatment so that most of the children die. There's about an 80% increase or more in the last 10 years of congenital malformations, that is, deformities at birth, born without eyes, born without mouths, without limbs. And this is one of the effects, the long-term effects, of the use of depleted uranium weaponry. When the shells explode, they make a dust, a radioactive dust that is breathed in by the mothers and fathers, and then as they bear children, or produce children, they produce these children who have these genetic defects. So we've seen a continuing problem here. It's not better. It's actually, I think, in many ways worse because of this long-term effect of the radiation from the depleted uranium. I think that to put our soldiers in here to create war again and do this to these people again will do simply more of what we've done for the last 10 years. That is, punish the Iraqi people. It has not affected Saddam Hussein. We've driven past a lot of his palaces and seen a variety of evidences that they are not affected by what's going on very directly, and I think it's absolutely wrong.
What about the President Bush, pushing through a new resolution in the United Nations that Baghdad says it will not accept to impose tougher weapons inspections on Iraq?
The Iraqis agreed to have inspectors come back in under the same protocols and the same modalities that were there before. The main difference and the reason why they're interested in doing that or are willing to do that is that they believe that the inspection agency run by Mr. Blix will give them a professional, clean bill of health. They don't think that they have anything to hide, or at least that's what they say. And they are willing to allow Mr. Blix to come in because he's a UN agency rather than the previous inspectors. And they do not see need for further resolutions in the United Nations. One European diplomat I read in the paper said this resolution of the United States is not a resolution for inspections, but rather a resolution for a declaration of war. And I think the Iraqis will resist that. They'll say, we opened the doors. We said, come in. But what your president is doing is simply trying to make it so that the inspections don't work.
Now Bush administration officials are saying that Iraq and al-Qaeda are linked. Your response?
Well, I'm confused, actually. They said that for a long time. The CIA and everyone has been working on this issue. It turned out that their allegation that an Iraqi met with Atta in Prague and all these things turned out to have nothing to them. They dropped that as the basis for the war and started talking about weapons of mass destruction, and they've had a very difficult time making the case. The whole world, except the White House, has rejected the dossier from Mr. Blair. And now they've switched back to al-Qaeda. And I suspect they will continue to come up with things that they point to as reasons why. But one has to question why all of it comes out just at the time you're trying to vote. What, have they been hiding it? Or have they known about it? Or did they just discover it? It's sort of strange it would come. The biggest mystery in Baghdad today is how anybody could think that the Iraqis would be trying to smuggle in whatever it was, 5 ounces of radioactive material from Turkey at a time when inspectors are going to be all over this place. The whole world's eyes are on them. And they said, what would make anybody think we were so dumb as to do that? So I have a hard time understanding. I know that the issue before the American people is whether or not we want disarmament in Iraq with monitoring going on continuously, or do we want regime change? And if our goal is to get Mr. Saddam Hussein out of the leadership of this country, then I guess we'll continue to have these attempts to link it to something that the American people will call believable.
You said on ABC Sunday morning that you think the President Bush, would mislead the American people.
I came into politics out of the Vietnam War, in which Lyndon Johnson misled the American people repeatedly. And President Nixon misled the people. And I believe that it's not above the present leader of our country to mislead us. I mean, that's why I'm here. I got into politics. I'm a physician. I didn't want to be involved in this stuff, but I got in because I was so upset by what happened in Vietnam. I had to deal with the casualties among our own people who were sent to war under misleading statements about what was going on. And I simply cannot tolerate a leader misleading the people about something as serious as going to war. Americans are gonna die in this thing, and the Iraqi people, the idea that they're suddenly going to fold up and surrender simply is an indication that people do not understand the character of 24 million Iraqis. They were going after 24 house in Baghdad, and our are going to be over here, and the question is for what? Are going to be because we can disarm this country by using the inspection, and that's what we ought to be up to.
Congressmember McDermott, Trent Lott, the Senate minority leader, said, talking about you, for him to be in Baghdad, the center of one of the most dangerous dictators in the world with all kinds of weapons of mass destruction, to be questioning the veracity of our own American president is the height of irresponsible. He needs to come home and keep his mouth shut. Your response?
Does Mr. Lott not think America is a democracy where we have the First Amendment? We have the right of free speech to say what we do. I would suggest to Mr. Lott he ought to come over here and take a walk around and talk to people before he sends the boys and girls in the military from Mississippi over here to be involved in this war. The problems with depleted uranium that are on the ground already. We're going to put troops in the way again. I have my interest in coming home has been part to do some examination of what the military knows about the Gulf War syndrome and how much of that might be due to depleted uranium. I come back home with a lot of questions that I did not have when I came over here, and I think that it's important for people in the Congress to come and see this country before we decide that we're going to just come in here and do a first strike. That's a major decision. And when we stop questioning our president, we are giving up a democracy and we're becoming a dictatorship.
Congressmember Jim McDermott, speaking from Baghdad. He was there with Congressmembers David Bonnier of Michigan and Mike Thompson of California. They are returning to the United States today. As they made their trip to Iraq, thousands of people marched around this country. More than 500,000 people rallied in Rome and England. We'll hear about those protests later in the program. But right now to Washington on Sunday, when thousands marched from DuPont Circle to the mansion of Vice President Dick Cheney, beginning with Phyllis Bennis of the Institute for Policy Studies.
We are here at a moment of choice. The choice is between democracy and empire. We can't have both. The choice is between internationalism and war. We can't have both. We need disarmament. It can start in Iraq. We need disarmament in Iraq, and we need disarmament here at home. We need regional disarmament, and we need the United Nations. Disarmament starts with inspections. We need the inspectors to go back to Iraq. The U.S. said they wanted inspectors back in Iraq, and Iraq said, okay, we want the inspectors back. And then the U.S. said, no, that's not good enough. Well, we say it's good enough. We say that we want inspections, not war. This morning, some of you may have had the opportunity to watch Congressman Jim McDermott and Congressman David Bonnier on the ABC show. They're in Iraq. They were speaking from Basra. And it could have been any one of us speaking there. They talked about the children dying of leukemia caused by depleted uranium. They said that in Basra, when women give birth, the first question they ask is not, is it a boy or a girl, but is it normal or not? Because the birth rates of deformed children is so high. And they reminded us what would happen to those children if there's another war. After they finished, they were attacked on the air by another reactionary member of the Congress. I urge you all to call the offices of Jim McDermott and David Bonnier and thank them for their acts. Thank them for going to Iraq. And call your own member of Congress. We know now that the polls in the Congress's offices, the calls are running 500 to 1, 1,000 to 1. We are going to make it 10,000 to 1 and 100,000 to 1 so that they know they will pay a price. This will not be a cheap fight. They will pay a price if they support this war. They think that if they go to war before the election, or if they go to vote before the election, that somehow we'll stop thinking about it. We'll stop talking about it. They're wrong. They will pay a price, and we will be in the streets to make that price higher than ever.
Damu Smith of Black Voices for Peace and WPFW Pacifica Radio.
Thank you very much. The last time I checked the papers the other day, incomes in the United States had fallen. The rates of poverty have gone up. More people are being laid off from work in every corner of the country. Corporate criminals are running amok throughout the country. The nation is marching off to war against Iraq, but they're already at war because they're bombing Iraq every day, and they have imposed sanctions against that country, and millions of people are dying in that country because of the policies of our government. The last time I checked, $6 billion a year is going to finance Israel's brutal and barbaric occupation of the Palestinian people. The last time I checked, we were at war on 3 fronts in South Asia and the Middle East. The last time I checked, we were helping to finance the war against the Colombian people. The last time I checked, an assault was being waged against the civil rights and civil liberties of this country. The last time I checked, racial profiling and police brutality is in vogue in the United States. And guess what? When that young brother was beaten by the police in Inglewood, California, when that brother was being beat in Oklahoma City by the police, I never saw anybody from Iraq on the scene of that crime. Because of all of this, I want to make very clear, some people are talking about a regime change in Baghdad. I'm beginning to think we need a regime change right here in Washington, D.C. Are y'all with that? The best thing that we in the United States can do to support the people in the rest of the world is to turn this system upside down and put the people in charge of this government. Just one thing, and then I want to bring on somebody very special. I want to repeat what I said yesterday at the march. Those who are fighting for global justice and focusing on the World Trade Organization, the IMF, and the World Bank, those who are fighting against U.S. intervention in Latin America, in Asia, and the Middle East, those who are fighting for human needs in this country, those who are fighting for the restoration of civil rights and civil liberties and to protect the Constitution, we need to come together in one hand, in one fist, in terms of a broad democratic movement to change our nation's domestic and foreign policy. Please give a warm D.C. welcome to Michelle Schott.
My name is Penny Evans, and I've just turned 21. a young widow in the war that's been fought in Vietnam. And I have 2 infant daughters, and I do the best I can. You know, they say the war is over, but I think it just began. I remember I was 17 when I first met young Will. On his father's grand piano we played good old Hearts and Soul. And I only knew the left-hand part, he knew the right so well. He is the only boy I slept with, and the only one I will. Now first we had a baby girl, and then it was 2 good years. But then came the 1A notice, and we parted without tears. And now it's 9 months from the last goodbye, and a second babe appears. And now it's 10 months, and a telegram confirming all our fears. Now my name is Penny Evans, and I've just turned 21. A young widow in the war that's been fought in Vietnam. And I have 2 infant daughters, and I do the best I can. But now they say the war is over, and I think it just began. And now it's every month I get a check from some army bureaucrat. And it's every month I tear it up and I mail the damn thing back. Did you think that would make it all right? Did you think I would fall for that? Oh, you can keep your bloody money, it won't bring my Billy back. You know, I don't care much for politics.
Michelle Schacht singing at the Peace Rally yesterday in DuPont Circle in Washington, D.C. Thousands gathered and thousands joined as they marched to Dick Cheney's home. You are listening to Democracy Now! And by the way, if you'd like to order a video or audio of today's program, you can call 1-800-881-2359. That's 1-800-881-2359. The protests yesterday against an invasion of Iraq followed Saturday's protests against the annual meeting of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund that took place at the Washington Monument. More than 15,000 people gathered. On Friday, the day before, more than 650 people were arrested. Many say they weren't even warned before the police moved in. Among those who were detained were reporters from the Washington Post and UPI, as well as the executive director of Greenpeace, who said he was just riding his bicycle on the way to work. We now go to the sounds of that protest.
My name is Scott Parkin. I'm from Houston, Texas. And yesterday I was at a rally at Freedom Plaza, which got basically blockaded in by the D.C. police. And they boxed us in and started rounding people up, some of which they were assaulting physically and putting them onto the buses. I had my hands cuffed behind me.
You also talked about seeing a photographer that was trying to get out of being arrested. Who was he?
There was a gentleman on the bus with me who was a photographer, and I was actually with him when they cuffed him, and he said he had State Department credentials. And then later on the bus, I found out that he was saying that he was the assistant photographer for Colin Powell.
Photographing the demonstration?
He was photographing it like as a hobby, just to take pictures of the demonstration. It wasn't in an official State Department capacity.
And they arrested him?
And they arrested him.
Behind you, marches going by of people carrying signs that say 8,000 people with AIDS killed today. Drop the debt now. Bush, we demand billions for global AIDS fund.
My name is Sharon Ann Lynch, and I'm with ACT UP New York and Health Gap Global Access Project. We're here with this big bottle behind me today to talk about Coca-Cola's refusal to provide AIDS treatment for workers in Africa and in other developing countries who are living with HIV and AIDS. Currently, we've got Coke on the run, where in June 2001 they promised, in addition to a number of initiatives, to provide treatment to workers. However, they only met their direct workers, 1.5% of their total workforce in Africa. So today, we're announcing the Global Day of Action to take place on October 17th, where groups across the country, and especially on campuses, in addition to a number of activist groups in Africa, in Thailand, in India, in France, Denmark, Norway, will be taking part in protests against Coke, saying it's not good enough. It's not good enough the 1.5% of the population that you've agreed to pay AIDS drugs for. It's not good enough to leave behind the children of workers, and it's not good enough to make promises that you're going to break. Especially Coca-Cola, it's amazing because they have such a huge profit margin that they enjoy in Africa, and they've been there for almost 72 years.
Why are you focusing particularly on Coke?
Coke was one of the first multinational corporations to come out under the media spotlight and launch a number of initiatives. One of these that garnered so much press was the idea of delivering condoms on trucks to rural areas in Africa. In fact, it's one of their main initiatives that they love to tell their shareholders that they're doing. They're not providing condoms to anyone currently via their distribution system in Africa, but far worse, they again refuse to provide AIDS treatment for workers. Their reach in Africa is amazing. They're in all but 2 African countries. They're one of the largest employers, and they can certainly set the standards for other multinational corporations. But now, however, they're even lagging behind some of the mining concerns that have stepped forward and launched comprehensive HIV/AIDS treatment programs for workers. Thanks.
Yes, my name is Ricardo Navarro. I am from El Salvador, and I am the chairman of Friends of the Earth International. We are a federation of environmental groups in 70 countries with more than 1.1 million people. We are here because we are concerned that the World Bank is promoting many projects that, instead of alleviating poverty problems or improving the environmental conditions, they are destroying the environment, they are violating human rights, and they are increasing the economic profits of transnational corporations. For example, oil, mining, and gas. You know, every time the World Bank, they put about $6 billion between 1990 and 1995 in oil, mining, and gas projects. Every time they do that, a lot of forests, for example, in Colombia or Nigeria, get destroyed. People get killed in those countries also. Water gets polluted. Indigenous cultures get disappeared. So we believe that the World Bank should not continue supporting this kind of projects. They rather should support clean energy, solar, for example, or wind, or how to get people better education, or health, or water. All these kind of things the bank should support. But they are more inclined to continue with the same system, strengthening the big corporations, and that is not the way for sustainability.
So you came up from El Salvador for this?
Yes, I came from El Salvador for this, yes, because that affects us in El Salvador the same as in everywhere in the world. Policies of the World Bank, policies of the WTO, the same thing, are just disastrous for living things.
Hi, can you tell me your name and where you're from?
I'm Rahel Chen, I'm from Ethiopia.
From Ethiopia, and are you a student here?
Huh?
Student?
Yes, we're a UVA student from the University of Virginia.
University of Virginia, and what are you doing here at the protest?
We have an organization at UVA called Salam. It's an African interest group, and we had a teach-in Tuesday about the effects of international debt, and we had different professors come and speak to us, and they were talking to us about the devastating effect economically, socially, and even culturally to these developing nations. So that's why we're out here.
And what relation does Ethiopia have to the World Bank?
Helena could do a better job answering that question.
What is your name?
Helena.
Also a student at UVA?
Yes.
And from Ethiopia?
Yes.
How is the World Bank related to Ethiopia?
Well, Ethiopia is currently suffering under one of the hugest debt burdens in sub-Saharan Africa, and a lot of the debt that Ethiopia currently owes was incurred by a government that was not supported by the people. And so a lot of the debt classifies under the odious debt clause. So we're demanding that the debt of Ethiopia be canceled, especially considering that Ethiopia has the 3rd highest HIV/AIDS population in the world.
My name is Jaime Esteves. I'm coming from Chile. I am the chairman of the state-owned bank there. And of course, we are a country of South America, a developing country with problems like others. And I think that this kind of meeting it is important because we can hear people coming from all the world and discuss with the international monetary authorities.
And your thoughts about the protest?
I understand that, of course, young people mainly could protest again, but I think they are wrong because they need to hear more people coming from different parts of the world. And the things are not so easy, not only black and white. The things are with some degree of gray, and it is necessary to understand more.
You clearly know well a country of a military dictatorship, Chile. You take countries like Indonesia, military dictatorship supported by the World Bank and IMF for many years under Suharto. What about that kind of support that these international financial institutions give?
Of course, I'm against that, but I think that also it is a risk if international financial institution could decide who country is a democratic one, who could not. And then also there is a complex situation, because if now the International Monetary Fund will have political criteria about the kind of regime in a country, it's another form of imperialism too. Okay,
thanks. Do you have a card?
Jaime Estevez is president of the State Bank of Chile. He was a longtime opponent of the Pinochet regime. As we turn now to one of the leaders of the protests against the World Bank and IMF.
My name is Lori Wallach, and I'm one of the 20,000 people on the street here in Washington against the World Bank, IMF, and WTO.
What do you think of the protest today? We're listening to police sirens right now.
I think that it is a sign of how much change has occurred and the public understanding and outrage about these organizations, the corporations behind them, and the deadly dominance of their agenda, because it's a huge array of people from all over different parts of society, and it's been a real demonstration to everyone in Washington who's getting leafleted to join the crowd that we're not going away and it just gets bigger.
I just interviewed the head of the State Bank of Chile, who's here for the IMF World Bank meetings. He said he disagrees with these protests because there has to be dialogue.
The only way in doing this for a dozen years now that there's been any attention paid to the substance or the conveyors of a critical message is when we've demonstrated power. And when we've demonstrated it in Congresses and parliaments, when we've demonstrated on the streets. Before that, no one wanted to hear about any of this, and there certainly was no hope for change. We're going to have to do more creation of power if we want change.
The 10 most serious problems and injustices affecting the world. You will see
former Green presidential candidate Ralph Nader speaking at the Mobilization for Global Justice rally.
And injustices, or indifferent to them, and very, very rarely ameliorating them. Dictatorships are institutions to cut deals with, to cut mining and other concessions by multinational corporations. They can live with dictatorships, but the people under their yoke cannot. The environment, relentlessly attacked by the fossil fuel industries, by the pesticide industries, by biotech industries, by industries that destroy the basic resource that sustains all life on Earth, from the land erosion to the water depletion to the destruction of the equatorial forests to the expansion of acid rain to the depletion of the oxygen in the oceans to the poisoning of the air and water to the buildup of global warming. Those come from corporate technologies directly utilized, directly imposed, directly transferred to other autocratic institutions. What this is all about, what today is all about, what the struggle for democracy is all about, is who decides, who pays, who writes the rules, who builds the future, who plans for humanity. Large corporations, giant corporations like ExxonMobil and DuPont and Imperial Chemical and Shell and Merck Sharp and Dome and General Motors, They no longer have any allegiance to country or community other than control them around the world. They're so willing to drop their U.S. citizenship and go to some tax haven in the Bermudas or Bahamas and still demand that the taxpayers subsidize them, the taxpayers bail them out, the taxpayers give them free research and development, such as drugs that are then used for massive profit against people who are sick and can't afford $14,000 for 6 treatments for Taxol, for AIDS. We're entitled to ask why we the people have allowed artificial legal entities that are chartered by the state governments to have all the rights that human beings have, and privileges and immunities and power that human beings will never have. How can we have equal justice under the law in the United States of America? Equal justice between you and General Motors, between you and Exxon? Impossible. We have to subordinate the power of corporations to the sovereign power of the people institutionally. Corporate. Business Week magazine put it very concisely 2 years ago with a cover asking too much corporate power and saying in 7 detailed pages inside the magazine, yes, yes, yes. This is a mainstream business magazine loaded with corporate ads, but had the courage in their editorial that year to cite a poll of the American people where 72% of the American people said that corporations have too much control over their lives. And Business Week concluded with the most succinct forward path for democracy in this country. And I quote Business Week, quote, "Corporations should get out of politics," end quote. People back home listening to the speakers of this rally are entitled to know that while they're being told there are no tax dollars for their public transit, for their health clinics, for their schools to be rebuilt, while there are no public funds for their parks, no public funds for a whole host of other necessities, there are billions of their tax dollars for the IMF and the World Bank that go through Congress without any scrutiny. People back home are entitled to understand that though they work hard every day, 47 million workers in this country don't make a living wage. 17 million make under $7 an hour. But the CEOs are making 530 times more than the workers in their country, in a fit of greed and self-enrichment that the world has never seen. Hundreds of millions of dollars going to one crooked CEO, corporate boss. And what are the American people demanding? And it doesn't matter if they're listening to Rush Limbaugh or Amy Goodman. They're all demanding the same thing. Catch those crooked corporate bosses, make them pay it back, convict them, and send them to jail. It's important to remember that we all have a big job to do. When we go back home, we've got to expand our epicenter of influence with our friends and neighbors and workers. Ask them to give themselves a chance to read about what's going on in the world, what's going to happen to their children and grandchildren if we don't roll back the forces of corporatism, oligarchy, plutocracy, dictatorship, and reaction once and for all. We have to do that because the world is a world of increasing risk, increasing technological risk, and military risk, and poverty risk, and disease risk. And the American people are at the top of the latter in terms of education and the ability to make a difference. And we've got to put that moral imperative on our back so we can help liberate billions of people in the third world and Eastern Europe and allow their genius to flower. You've heard how few billions of dollars are needed to save millions of children's lives, how few billions of dollars are needed to save millions of people who are dying from AIDS and tuberculosis and malaria and other hemorrhagic diseases, and it's not happening. We're spending as a world $4 billion a day on military arms, $4 billion a day. And we're spending less than $200,000 a day researching tuberculosis and malaria. That's the kind of maniacal, cruel, oppressive priorities that flow from regimes that are under the control of commercial interests who corrupt them as well as themselves. We have to recognize that the genius of the third world is going to save the third world. It's not going to be the World Bank, and it's not going to be IMF. The greatest idea of education in terms of literacy came from people like Paulo Freire of Brazil, not the World Bank or the IMF. The greatest ideas of giving shelter to people has come not from the World Bank or the IMF, but from the people's architect in Egypt, Hassan Fathi, who taught illiterate Egyptian peasants how to build little houses from the soil under their feet. And architects around the world are extending his work. It will come from ideas like the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh that provided microcredit led by Muhammad Yunus for millions, for thousands of women and other entrepreneurs, $100, $200 loans to build village-based enterprises. These and other ideas deserve to be widely publicized by all of us, because the multinational corporate model in these countries, backed by dictatorial and oligarchic regimes, will not work. What will work is agricultural credit cooperatives, independent trade unions, democratic elections, health sanitation corps, educational initiatives, and the production of food to become self-reliant, community-based, grassroots economies with appropriate technology. And October 4th, for those of you from New York City, New Jersey area, we're going to take the corporate crackdown on crime. We're going to take the crackdown on corporate crime to Wall Street for a big rally at noon on October 4th. We hope some of you will be there, right opposite the New York Stock Exchange, on the Federal Building, right opposite the New York Stock Exchange. So go back and focus on those 535 people. Make them put their voting record on their website. Make them come back when they come back home to meet with you. Educate them, enlighten them, put a fire under them, tell them they're there to represent people, not corporations, and make sure that they feel that there's a growing, burgeoning movement, that you may be 50 in a congressional district one day, and you're 100 a week later, and you're 300 later, and you are going to expand and expand until they respond to your demands for justice. Thank you.
Can I ask you about the media coverage. I'm looking at today's Washington Post, and we see police stretching is the best way to put it, a protester, and then riot police surrounding women. It says riot police trapped demonstrators before arrest in Pershing Park. It talks about a bank window being broken, and let's see, why are people suffering? No, it's the nation's capital suffered only a handful of minor disruptions, as they talk about more than 600 people arrested. What about the coverage? I see no one quoted talking about why they're there, on the front page at least.
Well, that's unfortunate for the Washington Post, because they should know better than become like a cheap tabloid. Obviously, the police interchange has to be reported, but there are a lot more important issues that the protesters are willing to give interviews about and fill more column inches. The whole thing is basically a manipulation of language. I mean,
Ralph Nader.
Washington, D.C. is suffering from corporate greed. It's suffering from excessive militarism. It's suffering from lack of sovereignty for the people to even vote here. It's suffering from the loss of civil liberties that have been passed through draconian laws like U.S. Patriots Act by a stampeded Congress, which President Bush initiated and signed. So it's sad that the Washington Post does not see through all that.
Also headline, markets fall for fifth week, profit worries, war fears blamed. What about the imminent bombing of Iraq?
Well, this is an issue that Mr. Bush is ignoring. He is depressing the stock market, increasing insecurity throughout the market, deterring investment, increasing unemployment. And I think it's only a matter of days before the business community is going to say to him, hey, you were elected President of the United States to deal with domestic issues and foreign policy, and you're spending all your time raising money with fat cat contributors and beating the drums of war. And that's not good for our economy. It may be good for the oil industry because the price of oil is going up, and the concessions in Iraq prospects are drooling the oil industry here. But basically, he is damaging the economy. He is damaging our civil liberties, and by his reckless moves toward Iraq, endangering our national security. That can be elaborated and will be by a few Democrats and Green Party people in the coming weeks.
Finally, there's a piece about a new mystery show, Push Nevada, and how, just like in the movies, it's all about product placement. This program just aired, and you've got the main character driving in an SUV made by Toyota Motor Corporation. They're using cell phones made by Sprint, and you can see the Lexus L logos on the front grille shimmering in the sunlight.
Well, if I see things like that, I'd never buy any of those products. And if enough people say that, they wouldn't do that. If 1% of the people refused to buy their products, they wouldn't commercialize entertainment programs by putting their logos and product placements everywhere. But it is a sign of rampant commercialism, putting a for sale sign on all kinds of sanctuaries and areas of our democracy that should be off limits to commerce, like the schools, like government, elections. That's what commercialism does. It puts a for sale sign on everything, and there are all kinds of things in our democracy should be never for sale, from our universities to our childhood, to our elections, to our politicians, to our government, to our schools. And what you just pointed out is another erosion of that important separation that must be preserved between commercialism and civic values.
Ralph Nader speaking after his speech at the anti-World Bank IMF rally that took place just next to the Washington Monument, with more than 15,000 people in attendance this weekend. The next day, the anti-war protest of thousands. At the same time, in Britain, hundreds of thousands of people gathered to demand peace and to decry war. Joining us on the line, Democracy Now! Former producer Miranda Kennedy was there. Welcome, Miranda.
Hi, Amy. Good to be with you.
Can you describe the scene?
Well, it was unbelievable. Up to 400,000 people were marching through central London to protest against both plans for a war on Iraq and to demand justice in Palestine. And to say that the British people are not represented by President Bush, for sure, and definitely not by Prime Minister Tony Blair, who's following along with his new dossier. And they were saying that this dossier, which Tony Blair came up with is recycled material. It's just a push for war, but it isn't a case for war, and it's not worth a drop of blood. And a lot of the demonstrators who were out were first-time demonstrators. It was a very mixed crowd. A lot of the Muslim population of London came out, Palestinian families, students, teenagers, in great crowds, all chanting, "No war for oil." And then some of the speakers represented the most official voices in Britain, which is something that's very rare, certainly for an American to witness. There were 3 members of Parliament who spoke. There were 2 bishops, and the mayor of London spoke out very harshly against the entire regime of President Bush.
Miranda, we're going to be playing more of the speeches tomorrow, but we're just going to give people a taste of the British rally with filmmaker John Pilger.
Asked by somebody from the BBC, didn't I think that the people of this country were really suffering from compassion fatigue? And I said, this is your answer. 350 to 400,000 people suffering from compassion fatigue like hell. It's a great privilege to be here. I think that today may well be the beginning of true democracy in the new century. You know, democracy is not a game played in an institution that rubber stamps a government. Democracy is not one obsessed man using the power of kings to attack another country in our name. Democracy is not siding with Ariel Sharon, a war criminal, in order to crush the Palestinians. Democracy is this great event today representing the majority of the people of Great Britain. Now, I've been to Iraq, and I've been recently to Palestine, and I've seen the suffering in those countries. The children dying in cancer wards in southern Iraq, dying because their country is denied the equipment to fight their cancer and to clean up battlefields contaminated by depleted uranium, a weapon of mass destruction used by the United States and Britain 12 years ago. Let me quote 2 American scholars, John and Carl Muller, who have examined objectively all the statistics of suffering in Iraq since the embargo was imposed 12 years ago. They conclude, and I quote, "Economic sanctions have probably already taken the lives of more people in Iraq that have been killed by all weapons of mass destruction in history." That research appeared not in a campaign pamphlet, but in the American establishment journal, Foreign Affairs.
John Pilger speaking at the British anti-war rally, where up to 400,000 people gathered this weekend. And that does it for the program. If you'd like to order a video or audio cassette copy of today's program, you can call 1-800-881-2359. That's 1-800-881-2359. We want to thank Michael Green, Dennis Moynihan, Chan Khan, and Miranda Kennedy. Chris Abrams produced today's program. Mike Burke, Angela Karen, Alex Wolf, Annie Nagara, Uri Galad, Angela Alston, Mike DeFilippo, our engineer and music maestro. Our website is www.democracynow.org. Also this weekend, as we were filming in Washington, I had my computer and camera stolen. If anyone has any word of this, please mail us at mail@democracynow.org. That's mail@democracynow.org. Stolen at DuPont Circle, covering the Peace Rally. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for listening to another edition of Pacifica Radio's Democracy Now!